Welcome to Cycles TV, powered by the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. This is your host, Ron William, FSC Development Director. Excited to engage with our special guest, Martin Armstrong, based on popular requests from our FSC global community. Please like, reshare, and comment to help raise awareness. Now back to our FSC guest. Martin A. Armstrong is the founder of Socrates and Armstrong Economics, an internationally recognized economist and former hedge fund manager with over 40 years of experience monitoring and forecasting market behavior. Welcome, Martin, to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Honor and a pleasure, and we look forward to diving deep into cycle world. Just for our viewers chiming in when this goes live, top of mind themes include the nature of time and your discovery of the pi cycle, educational insights on cycle dynamics, especially for those new cycle practitioners that are keen to learn more, macro focus on ultimately the business cycle, which is a whole subject in its own right, but it'd be wonderful to share your insights on business cycle in action, but also your experience of that, the whole idea behind the long wave pattern, and of course, for those that want to take the back seat and wonder the bigger cycle of them all, empire cycles, your backstory in terms of collecting Roman coinage and how that provided a framework for looking at other empires, including the changes that we're seeing here and now. And then as a grand finale for those who can hold on until the very end, market outlook for 2025 as best as we can capture your thoughts for the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, interesting list. Let's go.
We do our best to prepare people for the changing seasons, but ultimately take it whichever way you want, Martin. I want to kick off by sharing your landmark report, It's Just Time, which was shared with me more than a decade ago by a client in Switzerland. And he said, if you're interested in cycles, this is a must read. And that certainly fast-tracked my journey in cycle world, reading that report on my flight back to the UK, as well as encouraging my attendance of your conference in the States shortly afterwards. So it's really exciting to have you here on the show with the FSC.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's certainly an interesting world that we live in. And I will say this. I mean, we have offices around the world. So we have offices actually in China, Middle East, Dubai. So I've seen everything through everybody's eyes. And the stark difference I can say when it comes to cycles is that in Asia, I never had to explain they even existed. It's part of more of their religious ideas. Whereas in the West, I think we always thought everything was linear. It starts like a preface in a book, ends with the conclusion, like a straight line. And I mean, when I was going to school, that's basically what they were teaching you. It's like inflation, increase the money supply, you get inflation, etc. And it's just not all true, and I had when I was about 13, my father was going to take the family to Europe. So I wanted to have some spending money myself. And I got a part-time job in a local coin store, which back then in the 60s was also like a bullion store. People bought gold, but they had to be in coin form, not bars. So I knew what gold was. It was $35 an ounce and it was fixed back then. And you could buy gold because Hungary, Austria, all these countries, even Mexico, used to continue to make gold coins, and they could sell them legally as long as they were dated before the great, actually 1947 was the last year that Mexico always kept striking their gold coins with that date. Austria, 1908, etc. So as long as they had that date on them, we call them restrikes, you could sell them. But so I knew what the value of gold was. And I encourage somebody to, want to see an old black and white movie with Cary Grant. It was called The Toast of New York.
We have that just on the screen. One moment. I'll share it now for those who want a welcome reference. Please continue.
I was in history class, and the teacher basically brought this film in, and it was about the Panic of 1869. And there's a scene in there where Jim Fisk, who's the character who was trying to corner the market of gold, is at the ticker tape machine, and he turns around and says to his girlfriend, Josie, gold's $162 an ounce. Now, I thought, oh, come on, it's only 35 today. How's that possible? Because of this linear idea that we were being taught in school. And it bothered me for some reason. I did go down to the library, looked up the New York Times on the microfilm, went to that date, and there it was, $162. So that, I would say, was probably my first inkling that, wait a minute, this linear analysis stuff, maybe something's not right, and it caught my curiosity.
I'm just looking at that chart, Martin. It's a big spike on the chart that you produced there.
Yeah, he basically, the idea was that the U.S. had abandoned the gold standard during the Civil War, and they were going to go back to the gold standard. So Jim Fisk thought that if he cornered the price of gold, forced it up to whatever price it was on the New York Stock Exchange, the government would be forced to accept that price to go back to the gold standard. That was the whole scheme. Okay. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but it was very interesting because also what comes from that, the term we hear Black Friday, and they think it's a shopping day. No, they were.
Day.
You deposited a $20 gold piece in the bank. Now gold's $162 an ounce. You went to the bank to take out your gold coins so you could sell them, and the bank gave you a $20 greenback. You deposited $20, that's it. They started dragging the bankers out and hanging them. They had to call in the militia. That's in the film, basically. And so that's the real term of Black Friday. It wasn't a shopping day.
Martin, if I can spotlight your landmark report, It's Just Time, in terms of the meaning of that term, but also the connection to former British Prime Minister Lady Thatcher.
I guess the real reason my firm became the biggest globally, and I hadn't realized it until about 1985. We were going to open an office in Geneva, and one of our clients was the head of one of the top 3 banks, and I went to lunch with him because I knew there was anti-Americanism in Europe, so I came up with a bunch of names like European advisors, stuff like that. And so I was going to ask him what name he thought we should use in Europe. And he asked me, he says, name one European analyst. And I was embarrassed. I couldn't at the time. And I'm thinking, here I'm an arrogant American, I'm, whatever. I said, I'm terribly sorry. I just don't know. And he laughed and he says, there are none. He says, you don't realize why everybody uses you. I said, no. He says, you don't care if the dollar goes up or down. I said, it's just a trade. In Europe, after World War II, the politicians used the currency for political purposes. They'd say, vote for me, see the Deutschmark's up 10% against the dollar. That proves I did a good job. So consequently, there were no analysts. No bank is going to allow an analyst to come out and say, oh, gee, the Deutschmark's going to fall 25%. It became a political statement. Even today, you're not going to find any of the major institutional advisors come out and say that the euro will decline. The ECB will be on the phone and say, fire that guy. In Estonia, one economist came out in 2007 and said, we're going to go into a crash. They put him in jail for 6 months. So what we've seen is with this cancel culture, and that's been there in the financial industry, I can say, for at least since the 1970s. You could not speak freely of currency markets there. So that's why we became so big internationally. I hadn't really realized it, but we were getting called in basically by governments all over the place, because currency is important to governments. I began to see capital flows as a hedge fund manager. You get to see everybody's collects together. They all ran to Tokyo, then that bust, and they all go to Southeast Asia, etc. And we had one client, one of the top banks in Lebanon. And I called up and said, hey, look, could you make a model in the Lebanese pound? I said, they found a book where somebody had written the prices down to the 1850s or something. I said, sure, we'll put it in, see what comes out. Put it into the model, and it came out and said the country's going to fall apart in 8 days. And I thought there had to be something wrong with the data. So I called him and I said, look, there's got to be something wrong here. I said, it says your country's going to fall apart in 8 days. Very calmly, he says to me, asks, well, what currency would you recommend? And I'm like, huh? I just, I said, well, it says the Swiss franc. 8 days later, the Civil War began. I then began to understand, because we had another client who was in Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest shippers in the Middle East. And he calls and says, Iraq's going to start attacking shipping tomorrow in the Gulf. What do you think gold's going to do? I said, you're telling me a war's going to start tomorrow? Yeah. What do you think? Sure enough, that happened. I began to realize that there are people that understand if a war is going to place, they know what's going to happen in advance. Even the Hamas attack recently in Israel, you can look at all the defense stocks started moving up a week in advance. The government used that realization, because I had published it for some time, with 9/11. The SEC suddenly went out and they were looking for people who bought puts on airlines, days before. Came, kind of pretty famous for the Russian collapse in 98, and which was the long-term capital management crisis. Again, we saw about, maybe 100 billion going into Russia, but we saw like 150 billion coming out.
We've just got the chart here of the economic confidence model for that inflection point, 98, but also 07. And my question to you, Martin, for those who are looking at this for the first time, or for many people who've been following your work for years, what is the source of the pi cycle itself, but also what can you share? What can you share about the ECM model itself, just as a brief intro? So we have this cycle schema here, but also the roadmaps for the inflection points of 98 and 2007.
Well, working in that coin store, they had Roman coins. And I knew the Romans basically debased their coinage. They silver plated it. What used to be silver became bronze, silver plated. And I saw we did the same thing in 1965. We took the silver out of the coins and we made these clad coins, etc. So I began to see the patterns were the same. So that got me interested in the rise and fall, what repeats cyclically. So what you're showing there at the bottom, I was doing research in the library, Firestone Library, Princeton University. And I came across an article that I think it was 1907 that had listed these panics, 26 of them, starting from 1683. And so I added them up. I just took simply an average, and it came out to 8.6. I just thought it was an average. I didn't think it was like definitively or something like that. Fortunately, in that list, you see the first one is 1683. That was when the Turks invaded and were trying to conquer Europe. That was the siege of Vienna. Vienna was being the Holy Roman Empire. That was kind of like the financial capital of Europe at the time. Okay, so that was like the London back then. So I didn't realize it at first, but because that list was international, not purely domestic, that average that I came up with, which was 8.6, was 224 years and divided by 26 events of panics produced that 8.6.
I've just circled it there for our audience members down at the bottom of the slide. 224 years divided by 26 events equals 8.615, just as you said.
Yeah. And like I said, I thought it was just an average. Being kind of a history buff, I checked it and mapped things out. And I saw it worked from ancient times on. And what was stunning to me was its precision. I mean, it picked even 1987 crash to the day. All right. You look at, the peak in the stock market, 1998 for the Russian, where everything begins to change. July 20th, exactly the day. The bottom of the stock market, 202, exactly the same day. And I was kind of surprised at how could an average work to the very day. And not just once, but routinely. And so then I realized that this 8.615, the number of days in it actually equaled pi. And then I guess I said, that is the only reason I can conclude why it's so precise. And you have to understand in cycles. Like a lot of, you can't, like the Kondratiev wave has been distorted many times by people. What he did was he took the economy during the 19th century. We were 70% agrarian. So if you track the commodity side, you found the business cycle. All right. It did not work when you start getting beyond that because the economy changed. However, if you plotted the Kondratiev wave out, it still picked the peaks in commodities. All right, no longer just the economy, but it's kind of like, you can't develop a cycle in Germany and then apply it to the United States.
The cycle adapts.
Yes, it's the 8.6 cycle is because that list included international.
Okay.
And it wasn't just domestic. That's why it has withstood the time that it has. So it's the source is different. Everything has its own cycle. Everything does.
And just to preface that point, Martin, of course, that's the source of your discovery in terms of the pi cycle itself. But if I could take a step back and look at the ECM model, you've got fractal cycles that all work together. Could you speak a little bit about that framework as an overview in terms of the 309 cycle, the 51.6 cycle, which my guess ties in with the long wave, but then also you have shorter cycles as well that fit down below.
Yeah.
Everyone to see.
As a trader, I began to notice that markets were fractal. On a daily basis, like, maybe gold will be trading up, and then in the last, 5 minutes, it crashes for the close. And then I would see the same pattern on the weekly chart, and then the monthly chart. And then I realized that everything really in the universe is fractal. So, even, you marry somebody and basically the kids look like somebody. All right. It's fractal. We're always self-replicating. And that is just part of nature. It's universal. And then you take the cycle of the equinox is 25,800 years. Okay, 3 times 8.6, you get 25.8. So it seems to be this pi cycle seems to be a universal cycle that dictates pretty much everything. And then each individual thing has its own cycle per se.
Okay.
But it is all fractal. It will begin, you'll see on a daily level, then weekly level, and then will replicate to a monthly, yearly, quarterly, etc. So you go all the way up to 25,800 years, and you see it's still functioning at such levels. This is, I think it's the entire universe is based upon cycles. It's simple as that. You're not going to get away from it, no matter what it is. We don't live forever. We're born, we live, and we die. It's a cycle. All right. You can't defeat that. In economics, that has been the biggest problem. Because
on that point, I was about to say cycle dynamics, an important feature to the report that you published years ago, is the shape of the wave, but also this whole, dare I say, misconception of bell curve, equilibrium, but then your repositioning of a phase transition. It'd be wonderful to share your insights on that.
Yeah, what you get is what I do call phase transitions or things of this nature. It really comes from from physics. You boil a pot of water. It's not linear. All of a sudden, at some point, it explodes. All right, that's what a market. That's how a market functions. When I was called into the by the Brady Commission, the Presidential Commission to investigate the 1987 crash. I said, I was dealing with an academic and who all seemed to be enamored with Marxism, equality, straight line, linear analysis, whatever. Because that's really what Marx was about. Marx was trying to defeat the business cycle, smooth it out. Keynes did the same thing, all right? And that commission said, okay, we're going to go find the guy that shorted this market and forced it down, blah, blah, blah. And I just said, excuse me, do you realize that every investigation of a stock market crash since 1907 has begun with those words and they never found anybody? All right. So I said, you've never traded. Oh, I teach finance. I won't mention the university, but I said, that's very nice. I said, under contract, I have over, a little over 50% of the equivalent of the U.S. national debt. I know how things actually work. All right. And he said, how? I said, you're never going to find some giant short player. Impossible. I said, what happens is you get everybody long. Everybody who has ever thought of buying has now bought. All right. Some news comes out, anything scares them. They all try to sell. You pick up the phone, you call the broker, and what do you get? No bid. All right. So you get the Dow crashing 1,000 points because there's nobody in. And then you get these politicians who don't understand this and they want to outlaw short selling. The short is the only one with the courage to buy in during a panic. They just don't understand.
And the academic understanding of how markets work, or at least past framework, is the bell curve. Things are normal, they're random, and there are no fat tails.
Yeah, they don't understand that it's a confidence game.
Right.
And I mean,
which is a big feature of your work. The ECM model is the economic confidence model.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have been called into most central banks around the world. They know it's a confidence game. All right. Great Depression. Herbert Hoover comes out. All the, everything is basically really sound, blah, blah, blah. They have to say that. You think, a stock market is going to crash like in 07, the president, oh, shit, we're really in trouble. I mean, it would go down even twice as much. So it is a confidence game. That's what they have to do. What caused the 87 crash, and I was called in, when they were forming the G5 back in 85. And this is why, after that, I mean, I've testified a few times before Congress. I really just don't want to do it. Why? Because it's a dog and pony show. They summon basically 35 of us and say, oh, we've listened to the top experts in foreign exchange around the world. At first you think, wow, I guess I made it, and then you realize, how do we save the world? Oh, sorry, your 15 minutes is up. Next, and then they stand up and they just say whatever it is that they wanted to do to begin with. And they pretend that they have made this decision based upon experts. And it's not true. And it gets to, a lot of this, what we talk about, fake news. I was in Australia. I landed and I forget which newspaper it was, did a full page article on me. Oh, he's a presidential advisor to Ronald Reagan. They attributed everything to me, trickle down economics. Don't go listen to this guy, blah, blah, blah. Right. I called a journalist. I said, I really appreciate it. I just landed in Australia and I warranted a full page article. I said, but it'd be nice if you actually called the person and asked. I said, you want to call me a presidential advisor? Fine. There's probably 1,000 other people, you could do it. And to the best of my knowledge, they never did what I ever told them to do anyhow. All right. I said, trickle down economics. That was Art Laffer, not me. All right. So you end up with, the people in the press, they also don't know what the hell is going on. And they misrepresent a lot of things. But, you have to understand. I was in Tokyo, and we were just, we had just institutional sessions. They weren't open to the retail market. And this one guy apparently bribed somebody in the hotel to let him in the room. And he came up to me and he apologized for getting in. He says, but I just had to talk to you. I said, what is the problem? He had invested $50 million in the Japanese stock market and bought the very day of the high at the end of December 19. But what I found curious, he never, it was the first time in his life he ever bought stocks. And this guy was like in the 60s at the time, maybe 70s, who knows. But now I met the guy that actually bought the high. So I asked him, I said, what made you do that? And he explained, he said that for 7 years, brokers called him and said, look, the Nikkei goes up 5% every January. So he watched it. They were correct. So he buys December 31st, 1989. The market is now down 30, 40%. He's bribing to get in to talk to me. So I actually met the guy who bought the high.
Wow. All
right. But it was the reasoning. So that's why a market peaks. You have sucked in the last possible buyer. Right. There's nobody else left to buy. All right. And it crashes because everybody's long. For some reason, maybe some news or whatever, and they try to sell to get out. And that's where you get the no bid. All right. So the academics, unless you have some trading experience, I don't think you'll ever see this. And that's the real problem in economics. They don't get it. It's all just theory and whatever. I was down in Australia and I was invited by Macquarie University. And I went there for lunch, and the guy wanted to meet me because he had gone to Princeton, etc. And here Macquarie Bank was paying him, and he created a training program for central bankers. And he set up all these different rooms, and they had, their terminal, and he pretended he was the central bank and would raise or lower interest rates, whatever. And he would grade them based upon what he thought they should do. And I said to him, I showed him a chart. He took it in his hands. And I'm not joking here. He dropped it as if it was on fire. And he says, you don't believe in that stuff, do you? I said, look, every trader in New York, I think, looks at a chart, And he said he would fire, he would flunk anybody that did. And I told him, I said, why don't you use real data? I said, it doesn't work the way you're teaching these people. Sometimes interest, I remember, going into the high in interest rates in 1981. Things were different back then. All right. I would actually get a call from the Federal Reserve. Look, Marty, we're going to raise interest rates around 3:00. They didn't want people to get hurt. It wasn't insider trading shit. That came like 1987 with the SEC, and we can charge these people. They knew before this guy, The Fed tries to choreograph things with their minutes, etc., to prevent people from, going completely haywire. And then they raise rates, and then some fund loses 50% or something, So back then you would say, look, we're going to raise rates. It was mainly because they didn't want people to get hurt. All right. What I noticed going into the high in March of 81 was that they'd raise rates, gold would go down little bit. Finally, the last rate hike, it went up. I said, this is it. It's the end. Because the markets responded opposite of what they were doing before. So you don't get this linear idea. Increase the money supply and you get inflation. Not always true.
It'd be wonderful to share your insights on a concept which is maybe on the technical side, but one that I'm sure cycle practitioners ask as they learn. This idea of cycle motion and how that impacts the cycle. What can you share about that, and maybe the different types of cycles in your research, Martin?
Well, what you're showing there is two different types of cycles. I mean, you have longitudinal waves, which will move back and forth between peaks and lows, and then you have a transverse wave. But I would say the ECM is more of a transverse wave. That sits on top of everything else.
Okay.
All right. But then each and every individual market has its own cycle. And what I've noticed over the years is when they line up with the ECM, then you get those big concentrations of capital and the bust, like 1989 Tokyo, 1998 Russia. All right, these things, how capital functions, being in the international hedge fund manager. I was one of the first ones actually in that field. You begin to see capital concentrates. All right. So, and you have to understand, I would say the difference between an international hedge fund guy and just a domestic guy. Internationally, we have to look at everything from a currency perspective. There on that chart, you see the right one, the capital flows for the 87 crash. All right, this is what brought down the market. All
Japan
right.
net capital flows in billions of dollars.
Yeah. What happened? You had the Plaza Accord, 1985, standing up, saying we're going to lower the value of the dollar by 40%. All right, that's when I wrote to Reagan, this is crazy, blah, blah, blah. You're going to cause a crash within a couple of years. Why? They had sold a third of the national debt to Japan. Now you stand up and you say you're going to lower the value of the dollar by 40%. They're going to lose 40% on those purchases. They have to look at it from a currency back to the yen. All right, so then there was the Louvre Accord in early 1987. And this is what I mean by confidence. The central banks meeting was in Paris. Now it's a G7 from a G5. They stand up, okay, fine, the dollar is going down far enough. Well, the dollar kept making new lows. That was a confirmation to the marketplace. The central banks cannot control the value of the currency. So once that happened, from a trader's perspective, and I can tell you, because the Brady Commission called up, all these different fund managers. Why did you sell? And Dow had fallen 1,000, points. Biggest one day drop, some 20%. Calls the floor. Why? I don't know. Because this was all international capital flows on currencies. What I warned them would happen. All right. It had nothing to do with a domestic economic number, unemployment, nothing. Okay. This was pure currency movement. So if a domestic fund manager calls up, why? I don't know. He now has to sell to get out. He doesn't know what's going on. Maybe he's going to drop another 20% tomorrow. All right. So they have to respond. When you're sitting there, okay, fine, the Fed raised rates, whatever. Yeah, there's typically a bounce back. You can make those judgments as a fund manager. You've seen it before. In that instance, you have not. The lack of information is more devastating. All right, so that's why you get these waves that all of a sudden will be a very sharp, what we call a phase transition. It gets this dramatic rise or collapse, whichever.
In either direction.
Very short, brief period of time.
Right. Which is opposite to the bell curve theory. Yes.
It's driven by human emotion. That's basically it. And even in the Great Depression, and look at what, lowering, the ECB lowered interest rates to negative in 2014. They don't understand. Well, we'll force these people to stop saving and spending their money. You go into a recession, and what happens? People contract in their spending. They hoard cash. Cash becomes king. So assets go down, cash value goes up. All right. It's standard. You can see, in ancient Rome, it's the same thing. All the hoards of Roman coins are generally from the 3rd century. You got 20 emperors coming in back and forth, whatever.
Dare I say there's an asymmetry between fear and greed and ultimately confidence?
Yes. You can look on our site and then Google up the Roman Emperor Valerian I. He was the first emperor actually captured by the Persians in a battle. All right. And can you imagine if the president of the United States flew to Russia and they threw him in jail and said, come get him? All right. And we couldn't? That's what happened. There was a panic, a financial panic. Banks were questioning whether they should even accept Roman coins. Were they good anymore?
We just have the chart here. Martin, is this the one that you're alluding to?
Well, that's the collapse of the debasement. And you see it very rapidly there at the end, his son Galerius, but Gerlinus. But it's once that happened, then confidence just collapsed. People hoarded their money. And so that's why you ended up with the debasement. It wasn't official per se. It was just same thing with, the German hyperinflation, whatever. People have it kind of ass backwards. They think, oh, the hyperinflation came because they printed money. No, it was exactly the opposite. The printing of the money came because of the lack of confidence. In December 1929, you will also see on our site, the German government issued bonds and confiscated 10% of whatever you had in the bank. Now, if the government just took 10% out of your checking account, are you going to leave the rest of it there? All right. So people started taking their money and putting in every other currency, but German marks. So Now you had such a shortage of capital that the government had to make reparation payments and such. It starts printing money to cover its expenses. So the hyperinflation came because first, the collapse of the confidence. All right. And this took place in Rome. Once Valerian was captured, they even passed legislation in Egypt demanding banks had to recognize Roman coins.
And just to be clarified, that's based on the very long macro cycle, the 220 plus year cycle.
Yeah, you see these things because eventually it doesn't matter what government you're looking at. Human nature never changes. No matter what century you're looking at, we still respond the same way.
As a crowd cycle.
Yeah, look, I think in cyclical analysis, why some people are against it because they think it's predetermined or whatever, that's not true. What it is that collectively we have a cycle. Yes, that's the business cycle. You as an individual have the ability to be part of the mob or to go against the mob. All right. It doesn't dictate your personal future per se.
Day to day, we have some choice.
But yes, we still have that choice. But, the irony is that those of us that know history are compelled to watch everybody repeat it, but I mean, that's basically it. And why is there why does it come out to what we came up with was these waves that constantly build in intensity. So he ends up with 6 of these 8.6 year waves with 51.6. It seems to be also a generational thing.
Right.
This is why the Democrats are collapsing right now. They're still preaching the same theory that is from the Great Depression. FDR won. Okay, vote for me. I'll steal it from this guy and give it to you. All right. This last election, Trump won all 7, states that were on the border, per se, swing states. But he also won the vast majority of young voters. That's what I'm talking about. It's showing the generational shift. They do not resonate with this old theory from the Great Depression. So,
and just to add to your point on long wave cycles, Martin, in your paper you wrote about, cycle pioneers such as Kondratiev, but also which based his analysis, mostly on commodities and rates. But I'm talking about the pattern of 50 or so years. And then, of course, Samuel Benner, that had a variation of that. You wrote some interesting insights on on each of those cycles, the differentiation of them, but then more specifically how ultimately you then developed a very different interpretation looking at public and private waves, and then how that feeds through to your ECM model here and now.
Yes, I wrote the greatest bull market in history, a 2-volume set back in 1986. And which is why I got called into the Brady Commission per se, but in 87. But to do that book, I went through all the newspapers, and you'll see I put them in there, etc. We're going to republish it because I only have one copy of it myself, and apparently they go for like $3,000 or so on eBay. So to do that book, I wanted to understand why there was a bull market and why there was a crash. So I read all the newspapers going up and down. And I found it fascinating because going into the high, the thinking process was exactly opposite. You say, oh, Fed raised interest rates today. That's good. The stock market go up. Why? All right. They looked at it. There's still a bid for money. That shows the economy still doing well. And when you look at that reasoning, interest rates go down with recessions and depressions. They don't go up. Stock market goes down. All right. But you get the press has put out this fake news. Oh, interest rates up, stock market down. And just call up a chart of the Fed price, rises. They rose interest rates the entire time of Trump's first, term. Yet stock market went up. We called it the Trump rally.
Here and now, what's your view based on cycles, based upon the model, on rates and inflation?
We've now reached a point. I can tell you that the central banks are scared as hell. Why? Because this whole idea of Keynesian economics has collapsed. You can also look on our site. Paul Volcker, who I did have a conversation with and agreed, he says, Marty, your 8.6 is spot on. And even the Fed chairman before him, Arthur Burns, when Bretton Woods collapsed, he also came out and said the business cycle always wins. Paul concluded, yes, you're right. There's about an 8-year business cycle. All right, so all of this is quite critical to understanding this. With rates, where the central banks are trapped is that Keynesian economics was developed in the 1930s. The U.S. had a balanced budget. So, yes, the idea of Keynes, okay, fine. If we raise interest rates, lower interest rates, we can affect the demand of the consumers. Stimulate them to buy, tell them to stop buying. The problem became that the government is now the biggest borrower in the room. So, to fight inflation, Powell raised interest rates, and what happened? The interest expenditures exploded. All right. That everything that we've been taught in school is just simply wrong. It's not, the economy has changed and it's evolved. And these old theories are seriously dangerous. Look, even those that are advising Trump, yes, historically you're correct. Before the income tax, the country survived simply on tariffs. Very nice. Okay. However, we didn't have all this social programs and nonsense. All right. So tariffs are not going to be able to do that. But it's a different world today than back then. All right. And my concern is when you're talking about tariffs being imposed on Europe. Now, Europe is really the big problem, but Europe is at this stage in the game in its last throes of life, honestly. When they were forming the euro, because we became the biggest in the world on foreign exchange advisory, I've been called into absolutely everything, under the sun. When they were forming the euro, they came to me met with them in London, said, look, this is how we design a currency. And they were telling everybody at the time that they were going to everybody be paying the same interest rate, blah, blah, blah. We'll eliminate all the volatility. Trade will expand. We'll be bigger in the United States. I said, yeah, very nice, but you have to consolidate the debt. And I said, even explaining to him, as a fund manager, I can pick up the phone and say, buy me $1 billion worth of U.S. Treasuries. Europe? Oh, let's see. What do I want? Do I want Germany? Do I want France? I still got to make the same decisions. I said, all you're going to do is transfer the volatility from the currency markets to the bond markets. And that's what's happened. All right. But the reason the euro is in dire straits is because Helmut Kohl, who was the chancellor at the time, he admitted before he died he acted like a dictator. And he said if he allowed the German people in voting to join the euro, he would have lost 7-3. So he took Germany into the euro unilaterally on executive order. And so what he did was he said there can be no consolidation of debt because the whole issue in Germany would have been that they felt, because of the old hyperinflation days, that we would be taking on the debt of Italy and Greece, etc. So he insisted everybody retains their own debt. I said, this is not going to work. And I said, the volatility is just going to go to the interest rate markets. So what you're telling people, you all pay the same interest rates, not going to happen. I was told, and this was back in 98. All right. I was told we just have to get the euro through. We'll worry about the debt later. Well, here we are, 25. They never addressed the debt. And that's the problem. The shift between public and private, you're seeing it right now.
Just sharing this slide here on the screen for everyone to see. This is an up-to-date chart of your public and private forecasts. Could you re-clarify the meaning of ultimately that term? I believe it's confidence in public.
Yes, you have confidence in the government at that stage in the game. So the best performing assets during that period are government bonds.
Okay.
Stock market, it took like 1950s to reach the 1929 high.
82 was the secular low on equities.
Yeah, 32, right.
Yeah, 32 and 1982 in terms of the more recent bull market cycle.
Yes. A private wave is where you don't trust government.
Okay.
And you trust the private assets better. So maybe like gold or real estate, things of this nature. So they tend to rise more in a private wave than government wave. And I can tell you when I was young, my father would say the same thing. Oh, speculating commodities, that's risky, blah, blah, blah. Government, this was the idea coming out of the Great Depression. The government's there to protect us. That's what's changing. That's why I said the youth voted for Trump. You're beginning to see that change.
And is the main change, reading this chart, Martin, on the top right-hand side, 2032, is that a big inflection point for you and
yes.
for the market's confidence?
That's
in the private sector?
Yes, it's basically the not just the peak of this immediate private wave. It's fractal. It's 6 of these waves going back.
Okay. Even bigger then.
Yeah, it's much. This is like a 309.6 year It's more of the equivalent to a collapse in government. If you're talking about empires, etc. Last time we were looking at overthrowing monarchy, going to republics. This time we'll probably be overthrowing republics. I'd like to see us go to a direct democracy.
And for those cycle, let's say technical type, I read in your report that the K wave pattern is fed through these waves, but there's variation based upon your work because you're actually adding the nuance of public and private trends.
Yes. Plus, this is not based. This was based upon panics.
Okay.
Not so where the K wave was based upon commodities.
Okay.
So the commodities will peak with it. Like it really was a commodity peak in 1974. All right. So you get the OPEC crisis, etc. So you can't develop a cycle on, women and then apply it to men. I mean, it's so this is the problem. Yes, there are I think what in part what Kondratiev tapped into was that there was also a generational cycle. So it worked out to be like 52 years or so.
This is a 60-year idolized cycle looking at long-term interest rates on the 10-year.
But you have to understand that there is just simply, I think what the ECM is, because I didn't focus it on any particular sector, it was just the panics. So you had a different cause for each of those panics. Some were war, some was climate, shortages in food, etc. So the reasoning changed.
And what's your perspective on the Benner cycle?
Pretty much the same. I mean, that is more of a
that's a variation of the time pattern, but different.
Yeah, different. I mean, he's picking up on some of the a little bit of the fractal aspect of it. But again, he was more of a farmer, so he's looking at it from more of the commodity side.
Okay, got it.
And as I think what the ECM does is different in the sense that you have these different aspects. Commodity booms, stock market booms, etc. When that individual cycle lines up with this one, then you're able to say, oh, we're going to get a commodity boom.
And it's not a market cycle per se, it's confidence.
Yeah. I mean, that's what really drives everything.
Right. So when people are lining up the tops and bottoms and various cross assets with your ECM model, that's not entirely appropriate the way that it should be used.
Yeah, you have to understand that confidence does, I think,
there are lead and lags.
Yes, and it's right now like all the stuff coming out of. I was on a call actually before this with somebody in Germany, fairly high up, but who thought the deep state was a conspiracy theory. And last year he said, "Oh, you really believe in that?" I said, "It's not 6 guys in a room smoking cigars. I'm sorry, that's not the deep state." After what's coming out of USA, he's like, "Oh shit, I see what you're talking about now." I mean, so you're beginning to see that. What I've noticed in dealing with governments, and I've dealt with them all over the place. And I was even called in by the Bank of China from the 97 Asian currency crisis. So I've had a front row seat to all this stuff. mainly because we've been the primary forecasters to currency. And but I think that what you're seeing here is this idea that more and more of this stuff is coming out from USAID, and we're beginning to see they were handling money to Soros. Over 7,200 journalists were getting money. This is agencies that I have encountered. Once you create one, it's like even a possum will show its teeth when cornered. All right. Not going to lay down and pretend dead. You are looking at these things. I mean, take NATO. I've seen the internal memos. All right. NATO really should have been shut down after communism fell. That was its purpose. All right. Khrushchev was out there. We will bury you, blah, blah, blah. All right. It was an economic confrontation where they were against capitalism and they're going to spread their religion of Marxism to the rest of the world, which is going to save the world. This was their idea. All right. Those days are gone. All right. The Russian people, Putin, they're not interested in invading Europe and conquering it. Those are, come on. Those are all, the reasoning. You can't take Khrushchev and apply it to Putin. The Russian people aren't interested in that. The average person, I mean, I can tell you, because I've dealt with a lot of people from Eastern Europe that even came to the United States, and you talk to any of them, and they mostly say whatever they fled is starting to happen here. Cancel culture, stuff like that.
Does that appear on the ECM model? I mean, here and now, because I'm looking at the peak. If it's a peak in confidence, 2024.35 just passed.
Right. This is the shift. You know, Trump won. I mean, you can go back to that 51.6 year wave, which began in 85. All right, peaks in 2032. Just work out pi from there, from 1985, 0.65. All right, where do you end up at? 2017.05. What was that? The very precise day that Donald Trump was sworn in. Go back to the wave before, 1933. Hitler comes to power. I mean, these things, the very day in 2010, when Greece petitions the IMF for a bailout, right to the day. What makes it these days? It's fascinating to me. All right, but
and the bottom on the chart, Martin, so 2028.65 is clearly a low point, but then how do you read that?
We're going into a global economic recession between 24 and 28. Okay.
And then a recovery thereafter?
Then more of that final phase transition type thing into 32. What 32 is most likely is the collapse of Republican forms of government that we have today.
I have that chart here. I believe it's this chart here.
Yeah. These things happen. I guess, my mother used to say there's a time and place for everything, and I think she was very right.
Well said.
Look, when we have to understand, Cicero was the fake news of the ancient world. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not fight to get to Rome. The Senate fled because the people didn't support them. All right. And so what happened was that there was a debt crisis then as well. If you read the contemporary accounts, Mark Antony even bought Pompey's estate because he thought Caesar was going to abandon all debt. People were cheering. He was the savior of the people. Cicero was an oligarch. He's a dictator, blah, 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 threatening the Republic. The Republic was as corrupt as a $3 bill. All right.
I was just at the library yesterday looking up the Cicero collection. So
it's, unfortunately, the founding fathers of America read him and chose a republic.
Right.
They thought, okay, fine. That's better because you're listening to him. No, republics are the most corrupt form. Why? Because you can't bribe a dictator and you can't bribe a monarch, but you can bribe everybody that's in Parliament or Congress, right?
If I could throw in a kind of a devil's advocate question that often gets asked about history rhyming, especially when we go way back in time. So you're talking about the Roman Empire, and this was one of your big discoveries in terms of how history way back then can still rhyme now. What do you say to people who say this time is different?
Human nature doesn't change. It doesn't matter what century you're talking about. It's always the same thing. It's repetitive all over and over and over and over again.
This chart I found fascinating on your website, Martin. It's empires, nations, and city-states based upon solar cycles. So that there's lots to unpack here. But in the time that we have, the fascination of history rhyming so far back, and then of course this whole idea of natural influences of the sun inputting the human psyche.
Well, it's not just inputting the psyche. You also have,
or the mood, I should say.
When the climate gets warm, that's when you have the rise of these empires. When you go into cold periods, what happens? Like a volcanic winter, all right, crops don't grow. You can even read the letters of John Adams to his wife. Can't plant anything. The ground is frozen 2 feet deep. There was a big volcanic winter that hit, basically Byzantium. They said they didn't see the sun for a while. You also there's a book out, The Year Without a Summer, 1816. It was snowing in New York City. So the problem is when you turn cold like this, crops fail. When the crops fail, you get malnutrition. And what does that correlate to? Plagues.
Right.
And
this also marks the Roman peak that we were just alluding to here.
Yeah. Look, we put everything in our computer. Everything. From weather to diseases, whatever. And what's fascinating is it correlates it all. And then you can see these things really do. This is how society functions.
So all the way back to Sumerian peak, Egyptian times, Minoan.
It doesn't really much matter. We all, look, when it's cold, I don't want to go outside. When it's nice and sunny, I take a walk outside, right?
I'm here in the UK. You're out there in Florida. We're feeling the climate right now.
Yeah. Look, this is just the way it is. It's always been that way. There's a cycle to absolutely everything.
Yeah.
The planet is closer to the sun sometimes than others. These things all have impact. The climate change nonsense from these idiots. It's 2 degrees warmer this year than it was last year. So therefore they make these projections with a linear analysis. We're going to all die in 50 years, assuming that's going to be the same. That's kind of like saying, well, gee, the Dow went up 1,000 points this year, so it's going to do that for the next time of my entire life. Markets don't do that.
I read up on your website this chart showing the impact of the tropical zone.
Yeah, even that moves up and down.
Yeah.
nothing is permanent. Nothing. We have all the data. You can look on our site from weather out of New York City, which has been documented back to 1869. You do not see global warming. I'm sorry.
What's your perspective, Martin, on the Gleisberg cycle and how that impacts weather, climate, but also some are talking about a potential drought cycle ahead?
Well, yeah, look, there are, we're showing you're looking at food shortages, things of this nature, particularly after 2032.
Okay, so it's on your radar screen.
Yeah, I mean, so you get, look, these things have been going on for thousands of years. And our computer just has everything in it and is correlating it.
And this is the Socrates named computer that you developed years ago.
I named it after him because basically I liked his speech, his apology, if you ever read it. And they sentenced him to death. And he said, it's either a migration of the soul to go see all my old friends, or it's like a midsummer night's sleep, so peaceful not to be disturbed by a dream. How many of us have had such wonderful nights? Go ahead, do your best.
I'll give it a reread after this interview.
That always impressed me. I thought, he's, what you don't know doesn't hurt you. And if you actually do migrate, great. I get to see all my old friends.
What on this point, if I may, on a personal intellectual note, what inspired you to read the classics way back when?
Well, back then, to get into university, you had to have Latin. It was actually mandatory. I think up until maybe 75 or so.
Okay.
In fact, when I was in high school, the Latin teacher I had, she says, I taught your father, young man.
But you enjoyed it. You read it to study and also enjoyed it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I found it fascinating. We had to deal with Pliny, who witnessed the Pompeii eruption, or the Vesuvius eruption that covered Pompeii, and he wrote about it from sitting out on a ship. So, and the Romans were great at propaganda, and their coinage, the reverse was like a newspaper. So most of our history that's documented actually comes from the coinage. There's one, for example, there was a book called Historia Augusta. The academics were saying, oh, it was, it's fictitious, because they had a list of emperors in the 3rd century they never heard of. And so they said, oh, it's fake. It was made, and they even named a monk like around 500 years ago who made it up, and all this attributed to him or whatever. Lo and behold, what happens? They then find 2 coins in a dig in Egypt with the name Saturninus. It proved Historia Augusta was true. And then other coins were found in Britain, etc. They said the same thing about Homer. Oh, it was written for children, I took Homer myself, and I went all over the Greece, etc., and to go see everything. And every city you go to, Thebes, there's a little plaque thanks to basically Schliemann, who was a rich German industrialist who believed that Homer was history. All the academics said no. They even called him a fraud at first. He took Homer the same way I did. You go in there and you say, okay, fine. He set sail from here, discovered Troy. He discovered Troy. If you ever go to Mycenae in Greece, I opened up, Homer said, you walk through the Lion Gate, turn right, Agamemnon was buried in the shaft grave, right there.
Hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, I mean, so it's, but you get these academics with Historia Augusta, Homer, etc. They've never left their offices. And they all talk to each other, pat themselves on the back, just like this climate change nonsense. And they conclude, oh, they're fake. Because it was written a couple hundred years afterwards, so he really wasn't there, blah, 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 whatever. It's, there's a lot more interesting things, if you just keep an open mind. And most of I've read a lot of the contemporary accounts of different people rather than Cicero. And, you get to see, I did write a piece about Julius Caesar, crossing the Rubicon. I even had an academic write to me. He says, my God, I never looked at it this way. I said, because I cited all the sources, and they just listened to Cicero. Oh, he was a dictator, evil, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm sorry. He was cheered by the people. He was a populist. He wasn't an oligarch. Open your eyes.
But it's just the stories of history, but also the evolution of human nature, crowd behavior, and then in your work, mapping out the cycles of that. I mean, especially with the Roman coinage, which is, as I understand, how it began for you.
Yeah, because it was an opinion. I gathered a lot of the coins, had them actually tested to see. You could see the debasement quite rapidly, even during the coinage of Gallienus. He was the son of Valerian. Valerian's captured in 260 AD. Okay. So what happens? All right, the coinage is debased very rapidly and within 8.6 years. All right. What also happens there? The Roman Empire splits. You have the Gallic Empire.
Bringing the chart back up for everyone to see. Is this the chart?
Well, that shows the debasement, yeah. But politically, what happens? At that same time, Valerian is captured. So in 260, you see Postumus rebel and splits, and that becomes the Gallic Empire. Britain, France, Spain joined for a while. We're separating from Rome. In the East, I mean, they've made cartoon characters of her, Zenobia, Queen of Zenobia. She splits off Syria, etc., and even, part of Egypt. So Rome at that stage in the game split into three parts, all because of the monetary system collapse. Once the Roman emperor was captured in 260 by the Persians, then you have all the Germanic barbarian tribes in the north say, hey, they got away with it. We should do it now too. So then they start to invade. All right. So it's all question of confidence, the confidence that Rome could no longer defend itself.
And based on that model, I managed to get your chart here and now in a Romanesque fashion, the historical rhyme with the peak at 2032 that you cited.
Yeah, you see there 17.05, which is pi from the beginning of this wave. And you can just calculate this wave back. I mean, this goes all the way back to 6000 BC. All right. It's not, but here you have Trump becomes when this wave began, you'll find also on our site that we warn that this is by 2017 could be the first time we see a third party president elected.
Okay.
All right. This is looking at how long does it take? For example, you take the beginning of Rome, 509 BC. All right. Within 6 months, you have Athens overthrowing its dictators and democracy is born. So it's like one of these political sweeps of the ancient world back then. All right. So when communism fell in 1989, we had a bunch of people saying, oh, it was the communications because the Berlin Wall fell within 6 months. I said, sorry, that's not the issue. This has happened before in ancient times.
89 is the lowest peak there at the bottom left-hand side.
Yes, what happens is it's not a question of communications. Somebody from Rome could have, made it to Athens within a week on a boat. That's, and say, hey, they just overthrew their government, whatever. That's nice. That's not the question. The question is, how long does it take that information to filter through a society to cause the change? That's why with that Trump forecast, we said, okay, fine, 31.4 years from the beginning of this wave, we're going to see a political change. It will be the first time a third party type president can be elected. It's how much time does it take?
And on this big picture roadmap, while we're on point, as we wrap for this discussion, this is a peak in Western culture, if I can kind of spotlight that point. So it's not USA centric, it is Western nations, but also you mentioned right at the bottom there, a shift eastward to China. Yes. There's a lot of talk about unipolar, multipolar world, West and East, and this can be measured in many different ways. For everyone out there interested in these mega cycle shifts, what are you seeing?
This goes to the rise and fall of empires.
Right.
You had that with the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and it goes from them to the Persians, and the Persians to Athens. And one of the influences of Marx was Aristotle. All right. If you look at what Aristotle was complaining about, was that as Athens is rising now as the new financial capital of the world, because Persia has been defeated, all right? Aristotle complains that, and what I call the villa economy is declining. What I mean by that is that there were a lot of these villas and they were self-contained. They grew their own food, wine, etc. And Aristotle is complaining, and he calls it the people that make money from money. You get these brokers saying, gee, if you raise more wheat, I can sell it to somebody in a different country. So you end up developing a market economy in Athens. And they then begin to develop insurance. I got a ship, well, the ship could go down. All right, fine. Well, I'll cover the ship for a fee. So you have insurance developing. All right. So when Athens falls, mainly because of the Peloponnesian War, and Sparta's going after. Sparta was more of a communist state. They never even issued coins. People shouldn't have money. The state should own everything. This is kind of what's inspired Marx. All right. So Sparta invades and Athens falls in 404 BC. All right. Then you're seeing Corinth, etc. And then you have Macedonia comes down. Philip conquers all of Greece. All right. He gets assassinated and then becomes Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great goes to retribution to go conquer Persia. All right. And goes and gets even, all the way to Egypt. Then his Hellenistic period peaks and starts to come down, fragments. Okay. So then you have Syria, basically one kingdom and against Egypt, etc. So it all begins to split up. Then along come the Romans. All right, so then the Romans build up and create the new financial capital of the world. All right, and you can look, after the Middle Ages, you're looking at the Italian bankers rose because of trade. And it goes to Spain, and from Spain defaults, it goes to Germany. Germany defaults, it goes to the Dutch. The Dutch basically end up handing it to the British, and then we take it from the British. All right, so the financial capital has always been moving. So, we took it from the British basically because of World War I and II. All right, Europe blew its brains out, basically. That's really what happened. All right, so will we retain it forever? No, sorry. After 2032, it will move again. And you can see the descent, the division has become, deeply divided. Right. You have even California approving a petition to separate from the United States. So United States will break up. I mean, this is just in the historical context. This is just like Alexander the Great's empire broke up. Okay. Same thing happened to Rome. Same thing will happen to us. Simple as that.
And is your view multipolar world shift, or from one great power to another?
No, but it's more one great power to another. It's not that. Britain is still there. Okay, it's not destitute per se.
I'm waving the flag there, Martin, in London.
It's just that it's not the financial capital that it used to be. Okay, you can go on eBay and probably buy bonds from the 1920s from China issued in British pounds, because Britain, London was the financial capital. So you wanted to raise money, went there. Today they do it with New York. So you have all these emerging markets issuing their bonds in dollars. Same thing. Now, I can tell you the biggest problem with Europe is that they still are clinging to the old, I would say, mercantile type models. We make stuff, protect our people, and sell it to others. So, if you Google it, you'll see that what's the average wealth of a German? It's less than that of an Italian, because they keep their taxes so high. They're so afraid of inflation. They oppress their own people.
And that's recession here and now in Germany.
Yeah. The decisions they've made between climate change, Merkel outlawing, the nuclear power, putting sanctions on against Russia, the German economy has actually shrunk by 3%.
So you're seeing a shift. Globally, Europe maybe being more uglier than the rest of the world, and the US to a lesser extent.
And so, I can tell you from my observations of dealing with governments everywhere, what made the United States really the reserve currency, besides World War I and II and all the money coming over here, it was the fact that the United States was more freedom, and it was a consumer-based economy, unregulated that way. So Germany could rise from the ashes by selling its cars to Americans. Toyota could rise from, sell its cars over here, bringing Japan from. Neither one had gold reserves or anything like that. Okay, it's the wealth of a nation is really the productivity of its people. All right, simple as that. It's not. Look, Russia is the richest country in the world from a natural resource perspective. Most people don't know, but Russia had the world's largest gold reserves in 1917. When the revolution was taking place, we don't know who, but somebody hid all the gold reserves to prevent the communists from getting them. They've never been found. Rumors are that they were buried in some forest. Others said, well, maybe they're dropped at the bottom of a deep lake. Many people have been searching them for them. It's kind of like the Knights Templar, quest, I guess. So Russia, to this day, is the richest country in the world from a natural resource perspective. Why is it not the financial capital? All right, because of regulation, the communists, etc. So there's more to it than just gold reserves or something along this line. It's the productivity of the people, and that's what Adam Smith really was talking about.
And that feeds through to your principle on confidence.
Yes. Smith's Wealth of Nations. Why did he write it? He had conversations with the physiocrats in Paris. Their view was that wealth was agriculture. All right. So the guy who made the saddle for the horse, he was a parasite. He created no wealth. He needed to sell it to a farmer for his horse. So he was a parasite living off of the farmer. So therefore, when you had that idea, that's what sparked empire building. The more land we have, the richer we'll be. All right. Smith said, no, you're wrong. If the guy sells the saddle from London to Paris, he comes back with the same amount of gold as a farmer that sold you wheat. All right. So that's why he named his piece Wealth of Nations. Okay. So you have to understand the physiocrats, why he went. And most people never even heard of him, but this is so China is following the U.S. model. Take a look at what they're doing. Forget the headline propaganda. Recreating the Silk Road. They are desperately trying to create a consumer-based economy. They're not interested in the German model. Put up tariffs, we're going to build shit and sell it to everybody else. Yes, there's international trade, fine. But they're building a domestic economy. That is why they will become the next financial capital of the world. Instead of everybody coming here to New York to sell their debt, they're going to be going to Beijing. And look, I mean, I can tell you when we first opened our office over there, the head of police called in our guy there, and he was really nervous. We were going, oh my God, what's going on? We're, thinking he's being called into the police because we're simply opening an office there. He got there, and the head of police in China says, oh, so you know Mr. Armstrong? He says, yes. So what does he say about China? And it was like, that was it. So they don't bother us. They know it's basically a computer-based thing, and they don't have to worry. They don't page 3 overthrow your government, stuff. The computer is not biased on anything. We forecast every country in the world. The computer writes the reports. So, I mean, look, I've been on TV in Russia even. I mean, it's Middle East. I mean, a friend of mine in D.C. said, "Do you realize you're the only one that's not blocked worldwide?" I really didn't think about it until it was
a great testament to your life work, Martin, but also the power of cycles and real market experience.
I think that look, they're going to do. They did one film on me, The Forecaster. They're coming out with a sequel on it, but they're also coming out with a Hollywood movie on it. And, I think we're in like the 5th version of the script or whatever. But I can tell you, meeting with the head of the whole operations, he's in partners with Netflix, etc. What they are interested in is cycles. That they have looked at what I've done over the years. This next film on The Forecaster, he's filmed me basically since 2011, all these different conferences and stuff. And what he's doing is putting this together to say, look at all the forecasts that he's made. They all came true. Because it's not my personal opinion. I mean, nobody's going to be, consistently correct from a personal opinion perspective. We're all human. We all make mistakes, whatever. Like that ECM, look, you can calculate it out all the way back. Dates aren't fudged or anything like that. It is what it is. This is it. There is a cycle to absolutely everything, including climate. When you look at this stuff, there's a book on when the Bronze Age practically collapsed. I think it's called 1077, whatever. It was climate. Climate basically turned cold up north. They invaded. That's what the Egyptians, Ramses even has big records of that, of him defeating the sea people. Where did the sea people come from? They came from up north because they got cold, all right? So they moved south. So migrations have all been driven by climate. And so when I did the ECM, I didn't start off to say, gee, how could I find something that's going to do something like that? I just came across that those 26 panics. And it's taught me a lot over the years since. But there's only 2 ways to do research. One, that you end up discovering something, or you try to begin with a theory and try and prove the theory. It's usually that second way doesn't work because you don't really understand all the complications of everything that's there. I mean, here in Florida, there was a politician running because every once in a while we get what's called a red tide in the Gulf. Oh, vote for me, and I'll make sure there's no red tide again, blaming farmers and chemicals, etc. I just Googled what was the first red tide, 1642, reported by the Spanish. These people, it's like they have to blame somebody. I don't know what it is, but everything that happens we caused it or something. We may be able to increase, the amplitude from pollution, but do we have the ability to actually change the cycle of the planet? I don't think so. From all the data I've looked at, I mean, it's the same thing with, plagues. And I wrote a piece that Napoleon lost the war. Why? Because of basically volcanic winter. A volcano erupted. It got so cold. He lost, over a third of his troops trying to get out of Russia. It just got so cold. He was defeated by a volcano. So we have to look at these things, because everything is connected.
Wonderful to hear you say this after all so many years, Martin, and certainly on behalf of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, where we really are focusing on the interdisciplinary focus of timing in markets, science, and nature. Just this year, we published the book of Dewey, The Mysterious Force, which is back into publication for those that want to read some more. If for those who are wanting to learn about cycles, Martin, new generation, young people who are listening to this interview and they want to do more, what insights can you share?
Well, I have been convinced. Well, we're going to do a conference. It's going to be called a World Economic Conference for the Next Generation. We're hoping to put it together maybe in the next 2 or 3 months. And rather than forecasting markets per se, it will be how does the world economy really function? I can say that, look, I've had an amazing front seat and all this stuff. I was even part of the vetting process that they would send me in to meet with people who wanted to run for president and to explain how the world economy actually functions. And it was really a vetting process, because then I would get back, what do you think? Is he smart enough? Does he handle it? Maggie Thatcher, it's like I said, she just understood cycles naturally. And her opening speech is that we never looked at it from cycles. Maybe we should. I was restructuring Japanese companies that wanted to get into Europe for the EU and all that stuff. And if they needed skilled labor, like I put all the car companies in Britain. The airlines, I was putting them in Ireland because I got the best tax deal. And I didn't put anybody in Germany, but I knew her personal advisor, Sir Alan Walters. And she had heard this rumor that there was this guy sending companies to Britain. And she said, is that true? And he says, yeah, that's Marty. She says, there is such a guy? Yeah. I want to meet him. So that's how I got to meet Maggie. I don't hear you right now.
Yes, just to preface for those who are looking at this screen, it's the former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher address in 1996 at a conference that you introduced, where she opens by talking about cycles.
Yeah, that's why she came to talk. I mean, if she didn't understand or agree with cycles, she wouldn't have come.
That's available on your website, Martin, for those who
Yes.
would like to listen in. We can make it available on this video clip, but of course, please go to armstrongseconomics.com.
Even in 2019, at our conference in Rome, our computer had forecasted Nigel Farage would win Brexit. And he came and spoke at our conference, and he opens up. He says, of course I'm here. He's the only one said I would win. And so, I mean, I know Nigel, it was like, how do you do this? I said, look, it is all in the numbers, right? It's not biased. It's not anything else. We put out that Trump would win in a landslide. The computer's just never been wrong that way. It's been phenomenal. It's not a personal opinion. Politics follows the business cycle. You take Herbert Hoover, he was elected in early 29. Unfortunately, he got blamed for everything that took place, but he didn't cause it. All right. And actually, that is one of the books that inspired me to look at cycles. His memoirs are now available for free online, and I suggest you read chapter for 1931. And that's what really made the Great Depression so bad. It's not the stock market goes down. You can take the stock market down 90%. That may be a recession. It's the debt market. You undermine the debt market, you took down 9,000 banks. All right. The amount of money in debt versus equity is usually at least 10 to 1. All right. So in 1931, virtually all of Europe defaulted. Britain went into suspended its payments. Canada, Asia, same thing. South America defaulted for, I don't know, the 5th time or 6th time. So that drove the dollar up dramatically. It was the dollar that went up so high that created the deflation in the United States. And that's why FDR, when he came in, what did he do? He was listening to an economist, George Warren, who said, look, this is currency. Lower the value of the dollar and you'll get out of the depression. That's why he confiscated the gold and devalued the dollar from $20 and 67 cents to 35. Currency. All right.
And just on that point, Martin, your view this year, as a promise to those who are keen to hear your perspective. I mean, 2025 ahead. You mentioned currencies and the dollar. Do you see that continuing higher or potential correction? Equities, commodities, rates?
Yeah, the biggest problem you have is you have Europe beating all the war drums. All right. That's going to have, when the first bullet is fired, you're going to see capital controls coming out of Britain, out of Europe instantaneously. World War I, they shut down all the stock markets. They're afraid of capital leaving. All right. This is why you have the dollar going up right now. All right. It's the more you beat the war drums, the more capital tries to flee from wherever the event is going to be. Like I said, I've seen this from Lebanon to, I mean, everything. It's all been very interesting how things develop, but that's why I've been called in around the world, because people began to realize it's currency.
And for those who are trading equities, do you see a top this year in the U.S. markets or global in general?
In some regions, yes. You'll see a pullback to retest support. But it's this shift between private and public.
Okay.
Look at France. French corporate bond rates went below that of government. French interest rates on government debt went above that of Greece.
Yeah, I saw that.
When you have Macron beating his chest, we're going to send troops into Ukraine, that's World War III. Do you understand people are not going to want to invest in France? You might get nuked.
Does that give, I mean, some of that fear factor, is that part of the gold story? I mean, we're $200 off 3,000, right? I mean, it's hitting its drum.
Yes, gold goes up not because of inflation. Look, I mean, gold hit 875 in 1980. All right. It went down for 19 years while the US debt went up for 19 years, right? It's not inflation. That's been a sales job for people that don't really understand.
I just have the gold chart for your reference there. Gold 1980s. Inflation.
If you see what's going on, gold bottomed at $100 basically in 1976. It went from 100 to 400 by December 79. All right. And that was mostly because the dollar was going down. All right. It then went from 400 in December 79 to 875 by January 21st. Why? That's when Russia invaded Afghanistan.
Right.
It's more geopolitical than anything else. There is no correlation you can show me where gold goes up with inflation consistently. It just does not. It's the gold bugs then complain that because if a bank has gold reserves, what do? They lend it out to make money. Oh, that suppresses the price. Gold doesn't pay interest, and it costs money to store it. So you've had, banks lending out their gold to earn money on it. That it's just part of the game. It doesn't suppress the price or anything else. It's just that, eventually you're going to see gold going up.
And on a relative basis, commodities being super undervalued, this chart shows the ratio between the two and a generational rotation.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
which could be bullish commodities. Does that appear on your radar still or not yet?
Yes. I mean, we had warned that there was going to be a boom in commodities going in to the peak of the cycle, then back off a little bit, and then you're going to see again. In the commodities, you have effectively where inflation does impact, it's the cost of production.
Okay.
And not value for value sort of thing. Part of the reason gold went down for 19 years is that when it went up to 875, there was a flurry of gold mines opening up. So all of a sudden the supply rose dramatically, and everybody was selling gold. And as it would go down, they would end up having to hedge. I mean, I know I was called into many of the major gold companies, board meetings, things of this nature. It's been a fascinating career. I even had one say, asking about gold. I said, well, everybody's waiting to see what OPEC says today. Oh, that's important? Yeah. I said, everybody's waiting to see what they say today. Puts me on hold, dials in. They put me on the speaker box in the OPEC meeting. You can't believe how everything is really connected. You really can't. I've seen it, every which way from Sunday. I mean, it's been a fascinating ride. So it's what I say is not personal opinion. It comes from actual personal experience.
And it's that which we value the most, Martin, in this discussion. On your lifetime work, market experience, and the demonstration of cycles in action. I really appreciate your time, Martin. We look forward to future discussions. And as a final wrap, any insights you'd like to share with our cycles community around the world?
Just that we will be looking at I do a lot of interviews lately because I want people to understand. Because when 2032 comes, after that, we're looking at hard times, and we're going to have to step up and say, what should we create this time? I will say this, Klaus Schwab, who I have met, is his great reset is our 2032. He's just trying to, push things in his direction. I started our World Economic Conference in 1985. Klaus started his Davos in 1987. Marcus Vetter did the film on me, the forecaster. His firm brings in Marcus to do the film on him called The Forum. It's been back and forth. I can't tell you for decades. But Klaus is more of an academic, and he's trying to push it in his direction. And my computer says, sorry, you're going to lose.
To be forewarned is to be prepared, and certainly while we don't have control over the changes in the season, we can at least, as you're sharing with me, learn the principles and philosophy of cycles and how that can help us navigate the future.
I think the biblical story of Joseph warning the Pharaoh, there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought. All right. It's a cycle. And I think it is an example telling us that, look, if you understand the cycles, you stockpile during the good times, then the bad times are not going to be so bad. You can't change the cycle. But, and when you get all these people, chemicals, outlawing farmers or whatever, then you go into a cold period, and guess what? We're going to have starvation rising dramatically. Understand what's happening here. We will go into a cold period, and we should have reserves. Otherwise, just like Joseph told the Pharaoh. It's maybe a parable or whatever, but I think it's legitimate way you use cycles. If you understand them, then you prepare for the good times and for the bad times. And then you can smooth it out a bit more. But you're not going to change the cycle as Marx and Keynes attempted to do.
Prudent guidance. Once again, thank you so much. An honor and a pleasure. And we look forward to future engagements.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Let's hope we educate the world.
Look forward to it. And for those who would like to follow your work, Martin,
you can go to armstrongeconomics.com. It's completely open, free. You don't even have to put in your email. We keep it that way so it's not blocked anywhere around the world. We don't sell advertising.
Thank you very much. Look forward to following the work. Thank you.
Thank you.